So as we continue to talk about cautionary tales around police, use of force, and violence, the Emergencies Act was just passed today in Canada as we're talking. And essentially, as a response to the convoy and all of this Freedom Convoy protest, we're seeing a disturbing increase in police power. And this has been brought on, I think, by this kind of regression in public discourse when it comes to people who are usually liberals, calling for, I'd say, like military intervention, financial warfare, surveillance, and all of these police powers and state powers being reinforced, essentially because they don't agree with the views or the frustration of the protesters. And quite frankly, the kind of brutal tactics and the successful tactics that the protesters have used to have their concerns heard or, to go against the state in this specific way. So in this situation, we have people like journalist Justin Ling, who's been on the ground in Ottawa covering the protest, essentially saying that, praising the police for their restraint against protesters as they started cracking down and clearing the streets. So I think the biggest problem with this is that, we know that the police would never have this kind of restraint if the protest was Black and Indigenous people in the same disruptive way, or even in a much more, in a much less confrontational way. The police would crack down and wouldn't have this kind of restraint. And using this kind of argument of, police using less force as a reason to give them more power is clearly wrong when, like I said, we know that they would use that differently in a different situation. And I think also this idea that, if you're doing something illegal or like the protesters are, or if you're not, participating or supporting what they're doing, then, you have nothing to worry about. And, the following the law is the utmost kind of standard for not having things happen to you that, may be viewed as negative. But I think it's clear here to see that the fact that we're giving these tactics and the fact that we're taking things really lightly, like people's ability to access their own funds in their bank accounts, the fact that we're taking this lightly because it's being done to conservatives completely ignores the fact that many people have very, very rightful grievances against the state. And by just giving these things away, because they're happening to people that we don't like, is completely short-sighted in realizing that these things are going to come back threefold potentially to hurt people who are trying to have their voice heard against the state or trying to challenge the state in a meaningful way. So by saying things like, you wouldn't have to worry if you're not doing anything that the Freedom Convoy is doing, I think ignores the fact that people like land defenders who are trying to protect Indigenous land, or Black people who are trying to, uphold their own rights against the state or racism, will very easily face this kind of resistance or worse in many cases. So we're going to be going through some of the more awful takes on the next episode of a Cringe Corner, hopefully going through some of the liberal tweets that we saw about the convoy. And I think, this kind of conversation, this kind of discourse serves to funnel more and more power, more and more resources into the police. And again, in a fashion, like we mentioned before, where it doesn't necessarily even matter what the performance was. If they show restraint, if they manage things properly, then we give them more funding, we give them more power. If they aren't able to manage things, well, then that's the argument for, why they should again receive more funding to be able to manage things better. So in my own personal life, I actually attended the counter protest in Edmonton that was essentially blocking part of the convoy, or basically the entire convoy that was making its way to the legislature. So a couple dozen people essentially blocked one side of traffic that the convoy was coming towards, and then we allowed cars to pass on the other side. People were holding up signs, some, more funny than others. Someone had a sign that said, let the babies nap. I was holding up a sign that said honk for communism. I think that was pretty funny. But what I essentially saw once we started the protest, a police car essentially came and they honked at us using their louder than usual police kind of noise to essentially, I think, try to intimidate or get us to disperse. But I think it was clear from the beginning where the police was positioned, behind the counter protesters. It was clear who the problem was and, where the enforcement was going to happen. It wasn't going to happen towards the people who were given a court injunction. It wasn't going to happen towards the people who were, harassing people in downtown Edmonton consistently. It was going to happen to the counter protesters, the people who were trying to put an end to what was happening every Saturday in Edmonton. So what began with one police car essentially turned into a paddy wagon and about 10 or so police officers, and the numbers kept growing with batons, forming a formation essentially to disperse the counter-protesters. So things just continued to escalate as time went on. So not only were we kind of faced with the convoy, which was also, trying to pressure and trying to heckle or yell or do whatever they could to get us to move. But like I said, we saw the police mobilizing quickly in growing numbers with, weapons of violence, batons, to just crack down on the counter protest. Nothing came that far. After an hour or so, the group that we were with decided to leave because the police essentially moved in front of us in an attempt to, like I said, clear us out. So we weren't interested in getting arrested or, dealing with that kind of violent confrontation. So we decided to leave. The convoy, as planned, made their way to the legislature, continued with whatever, you'd consider to be illegal acts. And so I think in the personal kind of anecdote, you can kind of see a few things about what we were kind of talking about when it comes to delegating this power to police in a situation where you'd think that they would be using that added power to police or to prevent this kind of protest from a side that, I personally don't agree with or I personally don't see as valid. But that power wasn't used to, crack down on those people. It was quickly used to, intimidate and disperse the counter protest. So I think it's a small example, but I think it fits within the larger thing of by continuing to think that police are going to side with whoever you think that they should crack down on as a justification for giving them more power is very short-sighted. And oftentimes, I think, at least in my experience in this situation, we see what side the police choose to fall down on. And regardless, I think we know that these violent powers and this kind of enforcement shouldn't be brought down on anyone for that case. So this is where we are now. The federal government has passed the Emergencies Act. We have more power given to the RCMP, along with municipal police also being pushed to enforce and being pushed to be given more of this authority to essentially, put into place law and order and to prevent people from challenging the state. So I think it's important in this moment to challenge these notions, especially when they come from people who are, I'd say, from liberal backgrounds and who are making these kind of short-sighted arguments. But I think generally, it also brings in a larger question of what's going to be allowable when it comes to challenging the state, and what are the future powers of government when it comes to cracking down on dissent? Because I think ultimately the problems that we're faced with that are stemming from the state are still in place. And I think there will still need to be meaningful challenges to a lot of issues where you're going to have to confront the state when it comes to defending land, when it comes to protecting communities against the police, when it comes to a lot of issues. So if we have the Emergencies Act in place now, and if we have a culture that's so easily able to just hand off more authority, more power to the police, what does that mean for our ability to challenge these systems that we have in place? So I think that's the larger question that we have to deal with, that's been influenced by the situation that we have today.